Now, IWM in Vienna is the Institute of Human Sciences. European Alternatives is an activist NGO which promotes democracy, equality, and culture beyond the nation state. And so I suppose I'm standing before you both as an activist and also a philosopher with two hats. And I suppose crossing over those two ways of thinking about things, what I want to do over the next 15 minutes or so is to think about this question, the return of geopolitics and the youth climate movement. What implications for youth work? It's a big question. The idea really is to do some scenario planning, if you like. If one of our responsibilities as youth workers is to accompany young people, so accompany, for example, youth climate movement protesters, and also the movement itself, we might want to think about what's going to happen next. Predicting the future is a bit of a fool's game, but as I'm going to try and show to you, in a way, what I'm talking about coming next is already present. And I'll show you some examples. So what do I mean by the return of geopolitics and the youth climate movement? Well, geopolitics, I mean the way that the natural and human geography determines international relations, and notably the possibility of international conflict. So when we talk about geopolitics, we're usually talking about access to resources, territorial integrity, territorial continuity, identity claims, land use claims. Is the business of geopolitics. We're right here in Offenburg, next to Alsace-Lorraine. If you know something about the last 2 centuries of European history, territorial disputes about access to resources have been quite important in this region. And so those kinds of questions, access to resources and so on, energy supply, have what would seem to be obvious relationships with climate change. We anticipate that climate change is going to, already is, impacting dramatically on different aspects of geopolitics, and it does so in highly unequal ways. Some countries have got much more difficulty in accessing certain resources than others. Some countries are threatened with disappearing entirely. The Maldives, famously, is perhaps going to disappear underneath the sea, right? So you would think that these issues go together quite naturally. It's noticeable, though, that if you look at the discourse of the latest wave of youth climate movement, so 2017, 2018, 2019, the Greta generation, geopolitical concerns are not immediately thematized. The 3 main claims that Fridays for Future, but also Extinction Rebellion, at least at the beginning, tend to converge around is the responsibility of politicians and business to act now, listen to the scientists, and young people are disempowered, we need to have a voice in all of this. There's no obvious claim about geopolitics in there. To give you an idea of the kind of shift that I'm going to suggest to you, let's look at the origins of the climate movement. So in the 70s, some of you will remember, Greenpeace started in the 70s as Don't Make a Wave Committee. And what they were protesting about was nuclear testing in Amichka. They took a boat, which they called Greenpeace, to a sort of set of islands in the North Pacific, where they were saying, well, nuclear testing is potentially going to threaten biodiversity, but also potentially create a tidal wave, right? Don't make a wave. It could create a tidal wave which is going to damage North America and so on. So be very careful with your nuclear weapons. 1970s, the main existential concern was not, is the world going to burn? It was, are we all going to get blown up in a nuclear war? You look at Greenpeace now, 2021, well, they're still concerned about the waves, but, here they're blaming the cars. Here they are protesting outside of a car fair about, this is what's driving climate change, the cars. So they've made a kind of shift, if you like, from the peace aspect in the discourse to the green aspect. And actually, Greenpeace now doesn't speak too much about nuclear destruction, even if you could listen to the scientists, and the scientists will tell you that nuclear destruction is still pretty much as likely now as it was in the 70s, but it's not at the forefront of our concerns. So who's this? Hui Wu, some of you may recognize her, she's been called the Greta Thunberg of China. And here she is in September 2020, protesting in Guilin, in a region of China, as part of Fridays for Future. And she was not allowed to go to school anymore as a result of that. She came under pressure from the government. Her parents, who are university professors, came under pressure. She had to leave home, and actually now she lives in exile in Berlin, if I'm not wrong. Here she is a year later. I think she was 17 in 2020, and she's 18 now. Here she is a year later in London, outside the Excel Centre, protesting against an arms fair. Arms dealers are here today, this is not okay. She's holding a banner in front of the Extinction Rebellion logo and the peace sign logo. So there's a kind of shift from environmental concerns to peace concerns again. So what I want to do is to give you 3 examples of the way that in the last couple of years, the youth climate movement has had to deal with and address itself to some topics which have geopolitical dimensions, and to look at the way the youth climate movement tried to do that. How did it articulate its relationship to these issues? And the point of trying to consider those examples is, on the one hand, to bring out some potential tensions inside the youth climate movement. So how could it break up or start to come into conflict inside itself? And more generally, to try to motivate 4 recommendations for youth workers who want to try and accompany climate protesters and the climate movement over the coming period. So, I mean, the point is that it's important to realize, first of all, that the youth movements are addressing themselves to a global stage, right? So they're somehow involved in global politics, often organized the school strikes, the most important of them, at the time or in advance of global meetings of global leaders, and the demands are made to global leaders. But as I've already mentioned, it tends to be, you can't read it on the slide, doesn't, the address goes to politicians, eventually to business. But if you analyze Greta's speeches, there's very little mention of, for example, the military-industrial complex, what Truman would call the military-industrial complex, whereas wars can be quite polluting affairs. But they're global movements. It's important to understand, and there's a map I just pulled off last week. This side is Extinction Rebellion, showing where they're active. The other side is Fridays for Future. They're global movements, even if their leadership is coming from Europe and the West. To show that some of these issues are coming into the thinking of these movements, here's a newsletter from Fridays for Future sent out. They've been sending them out every month. This is the 5th one over this year. Look at the topics that are in this newsletter, which was preparing the global climate strike of the 24th of September. So there's vaccine injustice, climate refugees, indigenous peoples, varying climate responsibilities between different countries, the question of climate reparations, and the social impacts of climate change on minority groups. There's a section in the newsletter on each of those topics. Interesting to think about how did those topics get brought into a movement about climate change. So here's 3 examples of topics where the climate movement has had to address something more geopolitical. First example is the Brazilian rainforests and the burning of the Brazilian rainforests over 2019, beginning of 2020. You'll remember in the news there was great international condemnation of the fires in the Amazon, and notably of Bolsonaro, Brazilian president. There was even a kind of public disagreement or set of insults sent between Greta and Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro called Greta and the climate movement some kind of youth brats, and Greta criticized. So there was this kind of disagreement going on. The Fridays for Future movement related itself to the question of the rainforest fires, and so did the Extinction Rebellion movement. And they each produced videos. And I'll describe to you what happened in these videos to both articulate how the issues were related and also then bring out some tensions. So in the Extinction Rebellion video, which is full of celebrities, which some of you may know, I don't know them, but Joaquin Phoenix, famous actor apparently, and Korianka Kilscher, another famous actress, are doctors in a surgery theatre, medical theatre. And this video came out at the beginning of 2020, February 2020. They're trying to resuscitate a patient. You don't see the patient, but they're kind of like in a TV series. They're like trying to resuscitate this patient. You don't hear a pulse. At some point, they give up on the patient. You know, the patient is dead. But one of the nurses, or doctors, I don't know, who's being played by Korianka Kilscher, refuses to give up and tries to do a very traditional kind of CPR, heart massage. And the pulse comes back. And you see, and this still that I've taken is the moment that you see her hands go away from the heart, and you see that actually the patient is the planet, and the planet is burning, particularly in the Amazon rainforest and in Australia. And at that moment, the nurse removes her mask, and she's got indigenous tattoos on her face. And it's perhaps important to know that Korianka Kilscher, this actress, has played the roles of Pocahontas in films, and also Princess Kaulani of Haiti, resisting American colonization. So has a kind of heritage of representing in film indigenous peoples. And the film ends very simply with the question, what next? And an Extinction Rebellion logo. It was made by Extinction Rebellion and something called Amazon Watch, which is another NGO. Around about the same time, Amazon Watch, this NGO, made a film with Fridays for Future. Came out slightly later in 2020, around about May, June time. The character of the film is very different. It's apparently young people speaking into their mobile telephones, edited together, several of them edited together into a video message. But despite the appearance of informality, the message is very carefully crafted. And the message, it starts with Greta speaking, and then it goes on to various other people. The message is, first of all, to explain where Manaus is in Brazil, and that Manaus is the most important city in the Amazon, and that the Amazon is a crucial part of the world ecology for its carbon sink properties, home of biodiversity, and it's crucial to preserve the Amazon. Then it very quickly moves to say the people in the Amazon are coming under attack. The people of Manaus are coming under attack. They're at risk of a massacre. And the massacre is that COVID-19 is affecting particularly the people of the Amazon rainforest because of federal government failure of Brazil, and also invaders. It's unspecified who the invaders are. And so the message is, the traditional people of the Amazon need your help. Then Greta appears and says, the Amazon rainforest needs your help. The future needs your help. And then there's an appeal to global leaders to help the people of the Amazon. Right, so here you see how the Fridays for Future movement has tried to relate the COVID emergency, the question of listening to science, and the question of healthcare, the question of illiberal regime with indigenous rights, with the Amazon rainforest, with climate change, with the future of the planet. It's a lot of things to pack into a video of a couple of minutes, and they do it extremely effectively and powerfully. And with powerful words, a massacre is going to happen. This is like an appeal to the international community to save a certain set of peoples. So here, a geopolitical appeal. And if you compare the two videos, you know, aside from the questions of who exactly is responsible for what, the kind of points of tension that could be emerging are also around what science is going to be of importance to understand the issue and potentially to solve it. In the Extinction Rebellion video, modern science and modern medicine has apparently failed. to take care of this planet. And it's actually somehow the indigenous knowledge that saves the day. I don't know what the attitude of the Fridays for Future youth or the video makers would be towards that kind of scientific message. So that's a potential conflict. Second example is the refugee question. And as all of you will appreciate, in the time when the current wave of youth movements around climate were incubated, if you like, so post-2015, post-Paris climate agreements, the migration crisis was inescapable in the European public debate. It was everywhere. And what therefore happened was that the emergence of Fridays for Future movement, but also Extinction Rebellion, intersected with the Refugees Welcome movement and various other movements that deal with this issue. And so here you see how in Kaiserslautern the logos actually are being combined on Facebook of Fridays for Future and Refugees Welcome. And you can find many German cities actually have this, but also, for example, Venice, the Fridays for Future movement in Venice makes this link very explicitly as well. And that had, in a certain sense, been prepared, that earlier movements, such as 350.org, from 2015 onwards, had been trying to publicly explain that climate activists should be very concerned with the rights of migrants, amongst other reasons because there will be many climate migrants in the future, climate refugees in the future. And there was a kind of debate inside the climate movement about whether Syrian refugees were already climate refugees or not. Some of you may remember that. There was a debate about, well, maybe the Syrian uprising was in part caused by water shortages, and so maybe Syrian refugees can be considered, in a certain sense, climate refugees. I think the consensus was probably they're not, and in any case, there's no right for climate refugees, and so if you want to support the Syrian refugees, better call them something else. But there's a kind of move towards saying climate refugees should be recognized as a kind of refugees under the Geneva Convention, so that it gives rights. But it's noticeable that Extinction Rebellion in recent events have kind of gone a step further and said, well, you know what? Pretty much anybody who's moved throughout history, all mass migrations, have in some way or another been connected with changes in resource distribution, changes in farming conditions, and so climate justice migrant justice is one of their slogans, but it enlarges the question of climate refugee status to a kind of all-encompassing status, which at some point you wonder, well, could anything not count as a climate refugee if it's understandable why somebody would move? There's often going to be, very often going to be links with resource questions, energy questions, economic changes, and so on. There's also been a kind of intersection between the Fridays for Future movement and more prominently Extinction Rebellion with the No Border movement, notably in places like Calais, but also in the south of Italy. And so one sees how these issues kind of relate to one another, and there's potential conflicts there as well I want to signal to. In the scenario where there are more and more climate refugees, one can imagine different disagreements inside the youth movement about who should be prioritized, whether climate refugees have a priority over other kinds of refugees, who exactly counts as a climate refugee. And indeed, if one goes as far as supporting the demilitarization of borders, even the removal of borders, which to my mind is a legitimate claim, at least to be considered, well, that's starting to propose a very different kind of international architecture than the one we currently have. So it takes the climate justice, climate change youth movement to a place where it's starting to propose or consider a more or less radical redesign of the international system. Last example is precisely this question of weapons and war. And, you know, part of the context of this talk is that I'm not the only person who's talking about the return of geopolitics. Plenty of people in the foreign policy world are talking about the return of geopolitics because of, and you read about it in the news, the rise of China, the loss of US hegemony, the possibility of a new kind of Cold War scenario. This is out there as a set of concerns. And as we saw, some climate protesters are also making the link. But it's interesting the way that they are making the link. And so Huai Wu, when she was outside the arms fair in London, made a discourse, and also on her Instagram in Chinese, you can find the discourse, which is very interesting, the way that she relates the weapons question to the climate movement. She says, the arms trade is providing resources which will be used to suppress children who are concerned with their environment and to silence them. So she makes the link between the arms trade, the silencing of children and the loss of their political agency, and climate. There's other kinds of arguments you could imagine she could make. No? You could say that war in itself is very polluting. If you think of the burning of the oil wells in Iraq or in Libya and so on, it creates an enormous amount of CO2. There's an enormous amount of environmental destruction that comes with war. But she chooses to make the link with this important claim of the Fridays for Future movement in particular, that young people should have a political agency. And the link she makes is to say weapons will be used against children who are trying to claim something political, and what they're trying to claim political is save the environment. Now, the potential for division inside the movement here, I think, is multiple, particularly in the scenario where there is, to some degree, a geopolitical conflict. And it's interesting to note, I hope it's, well, in a way, it's a portent of what's coming future, that pretty much the same, well, in fact, the same day that Huai Wu was in London protesting about this, the American, US, Australian nuclear submarine deal was revealed to the world, a nuclear submarine deal which created great public debate in the country where I live, in France, because now it wasn't French submarines that were going to be sold, it was American submarines. But, you know, more seriously than that, is a sign of geopolitical alignment, concerned with who above all? Well, concerned with China in the Pacific, and in a context where China and the US are also vying for supremacy when it comes to leading climate transition. And these links have been made in statements of the military in discussing this new alliance. People have said, well, it's the new climate alliance, but it's preparation for climate war. Well, I don't know what climate war is, but people are talking about it in these terms. Even more succinctly, the Wilson Center in the US, which is a kind of think tank which deals with foreign policy and is attached to the University of Harvard, just made a publication entitled "Foreign Policy is Climate Policy." So the two things go absolutely together. And so in a situation of overt conflict, it's perhaps not accidental that a Chinese activist is in the London trying to shut down, I mean, that was their idea, try to shut down this arms fair taking place in London. So these are some of the ways that the movement has had to deal with geopolitical issues. I want to now spend some minutes on my 4 recommendations. The first is to try to accompany the current generation of the youth movement as it intersects older movements. One of the things that has happened in these 3 examples, but one could suggest others, like, for example, the way the climate movement intersected with the Black Lives Matter movement. I haven't used that as an example because it's less obviously geopolitical. But what happens is that the current youth generation has had to relate to people who've been mobilized on different issues, including climate, for much longer, adult movements. And the youth movement has received some criticism from longer established climate movements for missing out various issues. So they've had to deal with that. They've received criticism for being too white and not providing adequate space for the global south or migrant populations inside the global north. So that's criticism coming from the climate movement itself, but it's also intersected with other movements on other issues, but which cross over with the climate issues. So refugee movement, with anti-nuclear disarmament movement, with indigenous rights movements. And that can be a kind of uncomfortable experience for young protesters, both because it's taking them out of the issue they originally were concerned with, and secondly, because they're having to meet with and relate with movements which might be very much more structured, which have other priorities, which are run by adults. So it's important for youth workers to accompany the current generation. Similar kind of point is to accompany the current generation as it relates with other issues, geopolitical issues. And if, as I fear, the geopolitical issues will just become more and more present as climate change is more and more evidently happening and determining international relations, well, the current generation of youth climate strikers will be forced to increasingly relate to that, in particular because if the movement continues, it in itself can be considered as a kind of geopolitical actor. It's not a geopolitical actor as a state, but still, it's invited to global decision-making moments, to speak. At least Greta is, but maybe others will be. It has a global reputation, has a global impact, and so needs to think as a global actor. So, need to accompany the current generation in thinking through those things. On the other hand, third recommendation, that one of the unique things, I think, about the current climate youth movement is how young many of the people in it are, unprecedentedly young. In London, in Paris, in Berlin at least, and I'm sure in other places, some of the green protesters are as young as 5 or 6, taking their Fridays off of kindergarten to come to protest. I'm in full solidarity with them, and I think that they should have a space of innocence a little bit preserved out of these geopolitical issues, particularly in the worst case scenario where there really is climate war. A space in which you can just think about the climate and how precious it is, which at least I was looking for scientific evidence on this, and I haven't found any, so I just have the personal experience from my own children, who are very young, that it seems like the appreciation of the beauty and fragility of the natural environment is one of the first sentiments that goes beyond the value of the family that they can really have. They understand that, the butterflies are there, but the butterflies are very fragile. And so I think it's important for youth workers, to the extent they want to try and accompany and also renew the movement, to keep this kind of safe space, both for the well-being of the young people themselves, but also for a more cynical reason, which is that surely one of the strengths of this youth climate movement is, in a certain way, its moral purity. It is the youngest saying, we are bearing no responsibility for the climate crisis. You adults are failing us. And it's a moral claim, it's a moral demand. Well, in order for that moral demand to have its full force, it needs to come from the most innocent. And then the last recommendation is maybe not wonderfully expressed, but it is striking that the discourse of both Fridays for Future and Extinction Rebellion is very much a Western and European way of framing what climate change means and what its implications could be. And it's, I think, ever more important as the effects of climate change are visibly unequal and unevenly distributed across the planet, that the rest of the world is let in to the formulation and the conceptualization of what climate change means and what it is we're fighting against. Because some people, some young people, will be very much more dramatically affected in some aspect than some others. And so one goes beyond the generalities of we need to limit 1.5 degree global warming and so on to these people are experiencing flooding, these people are experiencing fire, these people are experiencing the need to move. It's important that in the way the overall message of the movement is framed, all of those concerns are adequately represented in a way that everybody feels they can have ownership over. Otherwise, there's a danger of the movement losing its global character and its global unity, because people will be talking, they'll be just talking past each other, if not talking openly in conflict. So these are my 4 recommendations. As I said, the whole presentation is an exercise in future thinking and so easily criticizable. But it's striking to me that very few people are thinking about the relationship between these geopolitical issues and the youth climate movement. And as I tried to show, this has already come together. It's not something far in the future. It's something which is already happening right now. So I think it's urgent to think about it. Thanks very much. No escape.
Stay, don't move. Good, thanks a lot for really widening this picture. As you said, the future is already here. Questions to Niccolò? Comments, reactions? Do you have no, I bring the mic.
Thank you, Niccolò. Very interesting presentation, and you ended with saying very few people are thinking about it, but I mean, as you showed, the young people themselves are thinking about it, and we're following in their footsteps in trying to make sense of it and accompany them. And I was really interested in the example of, and forgive me if I get the pronunciation wrong, how you?
I don't know, so.
And her claim making around young people's rights to protest being a reason to oppose the arms trade, because I think very often actually we see young people adopting claims for justice from other groups in order to be heard. So for example, the Lausanne Declaration, which was the declaration that the Fridays for Future movement developed at their meeting in 2019 in Lausanne, about 500 young people. Their 3 key demands were keep global temperature rises below 1.5, ensure climate justice and equity, and listen to the science. So there's nothing there about the rights of young people, nothing there about them as actors. And I think we often find that in those international spaces, like in the UNFCCC, young people are marginalized to the point that they don't make claims on behalf of themselves. They adopt the claims of other adult actors, such as the demand climate justice groups. So it's just an interesting reflection on what you were saying. And I think just a second point to note that was coming up for me when I was listening to you is how a lot of what you spoke about played out in XOR as well, and is an issue for the adults. And XOR began to try to address it with what they call their movement of movements strategy. So how do we account for difference, account for different voices, and as you say, contain conflict if within the movement to maintain unity. So it's absolutely not just an issue for young people, I think.
Yeah, thanks. Maybe it's worth commenting that I think it's important to look at both Fridays for Future and XR, even if the Extinction Rebellion participation is much more intergenerational, it's even perhaps dominated by middle-aged people, shall we say, because I think that the younger generation are at least aware, even if they don't participate in it, they're aware that XR tactics are another option. They have this slightly more insurrectionary character. So I think that's one reason to think about the two in relation. It's one of the reasons why I made the comparison between the two videos. I also think that for youth workers, it's important to realize that, I mean, who knows about Fridays for Future, but with XR, it's clear that there's adults running the show. I mean, it's been created by people who've thought about, what does it take to make a revolution and this kind of insurrectionary avant-garde. And so those adults are already involved. What does that mean about the responsibility of youth workers to engage with young people in those movements as a counterweight, as a support? I mean, but it's an important question, I think.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. You have a mic there? Mm-hmm. It's on.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. I was very glad to see you spoke about the intersection between climate and war as well. And I've seen a student ask UN Secretary General Guterres about the military-industrial complex and saying UN is always speaking about peace and all these social justice issues, but very little about that and the billions that are made. And his response was very diplomatic and very empty, very much not critical in comparison to what UN allows themselves to say when they criticize member states for not reacting to climate change. So I was interested if you could reflect a bit more on the space that there is within the climate movement to tackle also this issue, and is there fear that once young people start really speaking about the military-industrial complex, that these movements could get shut down way more, because then they would be much more dangerous to the status quo?
Yeah, I mean, surely the last point is right. And I haven't thought about it enough or followed all of, I'm pleased to hear that some young people are challenging the UN Secretary General about this, because I couldn't find much discussion. One aspect I looked at was what did Fridays for Future say about the situation in Afghanistan over the summer, where the US pulled out, and there's an evident risk to young people, amongst others, in particular young women, in Afghanistan. And to be honest, what I found was very neutral in terms of not wanting to take any sides and just expressing a general humanitarian concern. So that I found was interesting. There wasn't any reflex to criticize the US, for example, which could have been there in other kinds of movements. That this is outrageous, you've abandoned the young people. I didn't find much evidence of this kind of discourse. On the other hand, I didn't find much evidence of the climate movement really condemning the Taliban either. It was very much kind of like, this is potentially a disaster. So that was striking to me, and I wonder whether the movement might be pushed more into taking sides in future conflicts. And I think that, or in advance of future conflicts, and I think in many Western European countries, but also in the US, there is discussion about renewing nuclear arsenals, improving their military capabilities in view of potential conflict, and that creates sites of conflict, which won't just be arms fairs, but it will be where the nuclear weapons are being produced or redeployed in the north of Scotland or wherever they may be. And I think at those sites of conflict, we will see the young people, and probably that they will have to invent new ways of acting. I mean, I think that school strikes are appropriate when you are perhaps apparently effective, when you're trying to draw global attention to an issue and address yourself to global decision makers. But when it comes to specific sites where technology which is going to influence the global future is being developed or deployed, it's very much more site specific, and the risks involved are much higher as well for the people who become active.
Thank you. Any other comments, questions to Niccolò? Yes.
Hi. You were talking about that the youth movement should stay like a safe place, a place for wonder and innocence and the moral purity. One of the things that the movement faces is that it's often framed as a scapegoat for an adult movement, and that it's actually being used by other forces at work. How do you match those two things, and what would be the right strategy? Because it would involve, if youth work gets involved, like professionalized youth work gets involved in the things, it could be an argument that is added to that scapegoat theory.
Yeah, I see. I certainly see that risk. I think that the space of innocence that I was talking about is really for the youngest. Now, then one needs to think about, well, how old does that go? You know, where does it start and where does it end? And I don't have a good answer to that question. But I think that one needs to start to think of a youth movement which is aging. I mean, it's already happened that some of these leaders have moved from what we would normally call youth to what we would normally call adulthood in the short time that this movement has already existed, and that process is obviously going to continue. So one needs to think of a movement which is crossing different kinds of generations, but perhaps is being led by a generation which has been marked by certain experiences. And I think the experience that marks the Fridays for Future movement is the passage from climate change being something which is still contestable and deniable to climate change being broadly consensually appreciated, both in societies and amongst global leaders with some kind of rebels, and where people think that they can see the immediate effects of climate change. You know, we feel like we can see it because there's fires in Greece or there's fires in the Amazon. So this is what has marked this generation, this passage. And I think that we need to think about how that might be an important position to maintain, but how the people who come after will be relating to other kinds of issues. The risk of instrumentalization is one side of the risk. The other side of the risk is this kind of fake naivety. And people say, yeah, but I mean, this is just the world of My Little Pony and Bisounours. And it struck me that in the debates in Lausanne, the young people themselves were aware of this risk, that looking very naive. But there were arguments saying, no, we have to keep the side of kind of innocence, because this is our strength. It's our strength both because it reinforces our claim as children, but it also allows us to say things which might be quite radical without appearing too politically, ideologically motivated. So to talk about system change without appearing as, you know, ideological leftists, by maintaining a veneer at least. So I think that young people themselves can also be quite aware of these risks, and again, the role of youth workers is to kind of support them and help them to think through their own strategies for dealing with these things. But you're not going to do that, I don't think, with 5- and 6-year-olds. You need to protect them.
Thank you. Andreas?
Yeah, thank you. And I'm referring a little bit to a conversation I had casually yesterday over dinner also, because we're talking lots about the climate movement and how youth work can interact with it and what role it has to play there. And I think there might be other areas also where youth work could have a maybe more important contribution in relation to climate topics. Because when we look at the Fridays for Future movement, for example, and I think that's also a little bit what Finn referred to, they tend to really object formal structures. And so I really wonder, even on their behalf, would they be open to and interested in youth work playing a role there and entering the scene, so to say? So I think maybe we should have had a youth climate activist here to talk to them and actually ask them, like, we are now discussing about you and how we can interact, right? Like, what's your stance towards it? And at the same time, we're talking about a very privileged group of young people, as we know, very educated, who are mostly active in the climate movements. So what about those who are not so engaged? And what about those who are maybe having very different concerns, as we had, for example, in Howard's remarks yesterday. Maybe would youth work have a more essential and important role to play to follow the aspect of inclusion and making sure that those people are also dealing with climate questions and also expressing their personal concerns and all, because they might have very different issues that they're dealing with. So somehow for youth maybe to play a role in bridging those gaps and working more on the side of education for sustainable development on a low threshold level. Because also like bringing in the whole aspect of geopolitical considerations into the climate movement, it seems like a very ambitious task also for a general youth worker to have this ambition of operating on that level of complexity. So just my personal thoughts around, we're talking lots about the climate movements, but maybe youth work could have a more important and adequate role in other ways.
Yeah, I think that I think that the complexity is going to be unavoidable in the sense that whatever political issues blow up in the coming period and cause people to be out on the streets or cause wide discussions in society, they're likely to have a climate aspect to them, you know? So if the financial crisis happened again tomorrow, we would also be talking about this climatic impact or the ways that investing in fossil fuels had contributed to this or something. There would be a climate dimension to it. So I think that clearly there's going to be an important role of making the links. Now, when it comes to the most excluded and most disempowered youth, I would have thought, but there's a level of complexity which would have to be worked through, that even and perhaps especially with issues that might be of most concern with them. I'm thinking, for example, of the international drugs trade, which is not directly relevant to an individual drugs user's life, but I can imagine how you might get to a conversation about it with someone who is using drugs. So at least, I'm not suggesting that all youth workers are going to, in addition to becoming climate scientists, become experts on geopolitics, but rather just to think through a little bit the possible connections. Because I think that these questions will be coming and these issues will be kind of unavoidable.
Okay, one more question and then we go to group reflections. Maria?
Thanks. Thank you, Nick. It was a really interesting presentation and it's a bit bizarre actually because there's going to be a lot of overlap with mine. I just wanted to sort of comment on that last point regarding disenfranchised youth and my own work with refugees, it's about as disenfranchised as you can get. And I think there's a difference, perhaps we need to differentiate between understanding a person's politics of location and situated experience and expecting them to go out and protest. Someone who cannot even work legally to be able to put food on their table is not going to be interested in marching in the streets on climate change, or I'd suggest that they're not really open to it because it's not their priority. But that doesn't mean that they can't understand their situation and see the links. I think we need to sort of differentiate here. It's not up to every young person to take to the streets. There are different ways of acting, but that needn't necessarily be linked to not being interested or not knowing.
You agree?
Excellent point. Totally agree.
Yes. Thanks a lot, Niccolò. This was really amazing. Big applause for Niccolò's efforts.